The old man had been born into war, as had his father, and his father before him. He did not know what the world had smelled like before it learned the stink of powder and scorched earth, but he imagined it sometimes when the wind shifted just right, when the smoke thinned and the air carried something faintly mineral, like rain striking warm stone. He sat deep in a listening trench cut into ground that had been worked and reworked for centuries, the walls shored up with rotting timber, scavenged steel, and the bones of earlier fortifications. Somewhere above, unseen artillery muttered like distant thunder that never brought rain. This place, this front, had a way of making time collapse in on itself. You could feel 800 years pressing down through the mud. They said it began with victory. That was the bitter irony the priests liked to remind them of. Jerusalem, 1099. Holy banners snapping in the sun, blood drying on sacred stones. The men who breached the city believed God had finally smiled upon them, and for a moment perhaps he had. But beneath the Temple Mount, beneath layers of conquered history, the Knights Templar opened a vault that should have remained sealed. The old man pictured it often, torchlight glinting off ancient metal, air trapped for millennia, rushing out like a held breath, and then the voice. Not thunderous, not commanding, persuasive, warm, promising clarity where faith had always demanded endurance. That whisper, spoken in secret chambers heavy with incense and pride, was the first crack, the first heresy. When the gate opened, it did not roar, it breathed, and Jerusalem ceased to be a city and became a wound. Everything after was consequence. The earth around the gate buckled and softened, turning to sludge under marching feet and siege engines. Hell did not pour forth all at once. It seeped, negotiated, entrenched. By the time Antioch became the line that mattered, the war had already learned how to stay. Trenches replaced roads. Craters replaced fields. The sky itself seemed to tire of choosing sides, hanging low and colourless over a land where the dead were never fully gone. The old man's great-grandfather had fought near the Levantine front and written home about the smell. Sulphur layered over rot, oil slicking stagnant water. The copper tang of blood that never quite washed away. 8 centuries later, the smell was the same. Across no man's land lay the heretic domains, though domain was too clean a word. They were countries built around blasphemy, the way cathedrals were built around altars. Smoke rose from manufactories that never slept, where flesh and iron were fused in obscene harmony. The air above those places shimmered with heat and chemical haze, light bending around towers that plunged downward instead of rising, inverted monuments to a defiance that had long since stopped pretending it was freedom. The faithful called it darkness, but darkness implied absence. This was presence, oppressive, heavy, organized. The heretic legions marched out of those places. Not mobs, not rabble, soldiers, men and women who had made a choice, or had it made for them, and survived the making. The pilgrimage to Hell's Gate was spoken of in whispers among the enemy, but the old man had heard enough captured testimony to imagine it too well. The Valley of Tears, paved with screaming souls and blackened remains, heat so intense it blistered lungs with every breath. Bodies piled where the weak collapsed, some still twitching, neither alive nor mercifully dead. Those who reached the bronze gates were branded, claimed by names no priest would utter, and armed in factories where the clang of hammers echoed like inverted bells. Armour there was not polished for parade. It was scarred, pitted, etched with runes that caught the light wrong, swallowing reflection instead of giving it back. He had seen them through field glasses on clearer days. Legionnaires advancing in disciplined lines, boots sinking into mud that steamed faintly where hell's influence bled through the soil. Their equipment was brutally functional. Heavy rifles with angular silhouettes, bayonets dark with old stains, rebreathers hissing softly as they exhaled. No shouting, no chants. Just the measured sound of movement, like a machine too vast to see in its entirety. And then there were the others. The anointed announced themselves without words. Even at distance, you could feel them. Their armor was heavier, darker, plates overlapping like cooled lava flows. Heat shimmered around them in cold weather, frost retreating from their footprints. They had walked into the lake of eternal flame and come back burned into permanence, skin blackened, eyes reflecting fire that never went out. When they moved, it was with the confidence of things that had already paid the highest price and found it acceptable. The old man remembered the first time he saw one breach up parapet, lifting a weapon that would have taken 2 men to carry. The sound it made was not loud so much as final. Worse still were the nights when the trenches went quiet in the wrong way, when rats stopped scurrying, when even the distant guns seemed to hold their breath. That was when the death commandos came. No flares announced them. No warning prayers helped. They flowed through the dark like venom, black-clad shapes slipping through wire and shadow, hands speaking to one another in sharp, precise gestures. Tongues torn out long ago, secrets sealed in flesh. When they struck, it was efficient. Throats cut, charges placed, command dugouts turned into tombs. By the time alarms were raised, the damage was already done. The year of Broken Trinity had proven that no rank was beyond their reach, and the war had never quite felt safe since. But the sound that haunted the old man most did not come from explosions or engines. It was singing. At first, it could be mistaken for wind moving through ruined masonry, a low, mournful tone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then words emerged, carried on a voice that should not have existed. Choristers walked the battlefield carrying their own severed heads, blood still seeping from self-inflicted wounds, symbols forming and reforming in the cold air as they sang. Their hymns were not loud, but they were close, worming into the mind with visions of fire and inevitability. Men wept without knowing why. Others dropped their weapons, hands shaking. The choristers did not hurry. They did not need to. They sang prophecy the way others read weather, certain of what was coming because they had already seen it. Now, in 1914, the war was still here. Stalemated, they said, as if that word could capture centuries of attrition. The old man checked his kit by touch alone. Rifle cleaned and oiled, bayonet secure, respirator straps tight against his jaw. The trench smelled of damp wool, mold, and old fear. Somewhere down the line a priest murmured blessings, voice barely audible over the distant rumble of industry from the Heretic side. The sky above was a dirty grey, stained faintly orange near the horizon where the gate's influence turned night into an endless dusk. He did not know if the war would end. No one truly believed it would. Not in victory, not in peace. But as he listened, as the ground trembled with approaching movement and a faint, terrible song began to rise, he understood something his ancestors had learned long ago. This was not a war for land or crowns. It was a war of vows made in secret and paid for in public, of doors opened once and never closed. And as the heretic legions advanced through the mud, disciplined, burning, singing, the world held its breath again just as it had in 1099, wondering what new price would be demanded before dawn. The moment stretched. Not long. Just enough to become unbearable. The kind of pause that existed only on a battlefield, when the world seemed to inhale and forget to breathe out. The old man could hear his own pulse inside the seal of his respirator, a dull, rhythmic thud that synced with the distant tremor of approaching boots. Each vibration travelled through the trench wall and into his spine, not violent enough to knock him off balance, but insistent, like a hand resting on his shoulder that refused to be ignored. Around him, other men waited in their own silences. Some stared forward with the blank, practiced calm of veterans who had learned the cost of anticipation. Others murmured fragments of prayer, lips moving soundlessly, as fingers worried at rosaries worn smooth by decades of use. A younger soldier across the trench kept swallowing, his throat bobbing visibly, eyes fixed on nothing at all. No one spoke to him. Words were fragile things here, easily broken, and everyone knew better than to waste them before the first shots were fired. The singing crept closer. It did not grow louder so much as more defined, like fog thickening until shapes began to emerge within it. The melody was slow, deliberate. Every note held just long enough to settle deep into the chest. It carried no urgency, no passion. It did not need to. It was patient, and patience was a weapon honed over centuries. The old man felt images brushing against the edges of his thoughts again, visions he rejected with practiced ease, but which still left residue behind, like soot clinging to skin. He remembered being taught long ago that hell did not invent cruelty. It refined it, polished it, gave it structure and repeatability. That was what made the heretic legions so dangerous. Not their hatred, but their method. Everything they did was codified, ritualized, optimized for endurance. Even despair was managed, distributed evenly so that no one broke too quickly. No one burned out before their usefulness was complete. A faint glow appeared beyond the wire, not bright enough to be a flare. A low, ruddy illumination that pulsed in time with the chanting. The ground there was different, he knew, tainted by proximity to the gate, by centuries of infernal logistics bleeding into the soil. Mud steamed gently, despite the cold, exhaling a smell like wet ash and old iron. As the glow intensified, he caught sight of movement within it, silhouettes resolving into forms, forms into figures. The heretic advance was unhurried. Legionnaires moved with mechanical precision, spacing maintained even as the terrain fought them, boots sinking and pulling free in perfect rhythm. Their rifles were carried at the ready, muzzles steady, fingers disciplined. The markings on their armor were clearer now, etched sigils that seemed to absorb the weak light rather than reflect it, leaving their forms outlined in a dull, unsettling absence. The old man noted it distantly, the way one observed weather. Interesting, ominous, unavoidable. Behind them, something larger shifted. The anointed strode forward like walking furnaces, their presence warping the air around them. Condensation hissed away from their armor, frost retreating in delicate, frantic patterns along the ground. Their weapons were massive, built not for elegance but for inevitability. When one of them adjusted its grip, the sound carried even over the chanting. A deep, metallic scrape that vibrated in the chest more than the ears. The old man had seen enough battles to know that when the anointed committed, positions ceased to exist. There was no heroism in meeting them head-on, only delay. The first shots rang out without ceremony, Rifle fire cracked across no man's land, sharp and flat, muzzle flashes briefly carving hard edges into the gloom. The legionnaires responded immediately, returning fire in controlled bursts that stitched the parapet with deadly intent. Dirt and splinters erupted around the old man as rounds slammed into the trench wall. He leaned into his firing slit, sighting down his rifle, breath steady despite the chaos erupting around him. Training took over, muscle memory overriding fear. He fired, worked the action, fired again. Somewhere to his right, a scream cut short. The singing did not stop. It flowed over the gunfire, threading between explosions and shouted orders, never breaking rhythm. A chorister emerged fully into view now, advancing behind the Legion line. The thing walked with careful steps, cradling its own severed head like a sacred relic. Blood streamed from the open wound at its neck, yet the body did not falter. Symbols formed in the air around it, traced in drifting droplets and vapor, shifting with each verse of its hymn. The face it carried was rapturous, eyes half-lidded in blissful devotion, mouth open in song. The effect on the line was immediate. Men flinched, hands trembling on triggers. One soldier dropped to his knees, retching violently as visions overwhelmed him. A priest rushed to his side, shouting absolution, but his voice was nearly lost beneath the unholy chorus. The old man forced his gaze away, focusing on the familiar geometry of his sight, on the simple, tangible reality of the target before him. He fired again and again, until the barrel of his rifle burned hot even through his gloves. A flare finally went up, bathing the battlefield in stark white light. For a heartbeat, everything was exposed. The churned mud, cratered and strewn with debris. Bodies lying where they had fallen, some unmoving, others twitching weakly. The advancing heretics, their discipline unbroken. The anointed at the center of it all, towering and implacable, eyes burning like coals in the sudden glare. And beyond them, barely visible at the edge of perception, the suggestion of something vast and distant, a glow on the horizon that marked where the gate's influence thickened the air, turning night into a perpetual bruise. Then the light died, plunging the world back into smoke and shadow. Orders came down the line, shouted and relayed hand to hand. The old man barely registered them consciously. His body responded on its own. He reloaded, checked his respirator seal, shifted position as the trench shuddered under the impact of heavy weapons. Somewhere nearby, an emplacement detonated, the blast washing over him with a concussive thump that rattled his teeth. Dust filled the air, coating his tongue with grit and bitterness. Through it all, the heretic legions kept coming. This was how it always went. Push and counter-push, advance measured in yards paid for with lives, no sweeping victories, no decisive breaks, just attrition, grinding and relentless, a test of which side could endure longer under the weight of history pressing down on them both. The old man knew, with a clarity born of long experience, that even if they held this line tonight, another would be tested tomorrow, another trench, another dawn under a stained sky. He found a strange comfort in that knowledge. Endurance was something his people understood. They had been doing it since the day the gate breathed its first poisoned breath into the world. While the heretics chased parity with God, while hell refined its machines and rituals, the faithful endured. They held lines. They rebuilt cities. They buried their dead and taught their children the cost of vigilance. It was not glorious. It was necessary. The singing faltered for just a moment as one chorister fell, its body collapsing in a spray of blood and cymbals that dissipated like smoke. Another voice took up the verse almost immediately, seamless, unbroken. The hymn continued. The old man adjusted his stance, braced himself against the trench wall, and prepared for the next wave. Dawn was still hours away, if it came at all. Around him, the war breathed and moved and demanded its due. And as it always had, he gave what was asked, not out of hope for an ending, but out of refusal to surrender the world to the certainty of damnation. The line held. For now. And so the night holds. The guns cool only briefly, and the war waits for no one. Thank you for standing in the trench with me, for listening through the smoke and the song, and for giving this story your time. If you found yourself drawn into this world, if the setting, the mood, and the voices of the Trench Crusade spoke to you, then I invite you to explore further. There are more stories waiting, more moments carved out of mud, fire, and faith, told not as lists of facts, but as lived memories from a war that never truly ends. If you enjoyed this kind of story-driven lore, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps keep these chronicles alive, and it tells me that you want more short stories, audio journals, and narrative explorations from the front lines and beyond. Each one is another candle lit against the dark, another voice carried across no man's land. Until next time, hold fast, keep your faith close, and remember the words whispered among the trenches when the singing begins to rise. Hell does not rush, it marches, and it never forgets the way.